You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 20th of May, 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Some of Israel's allies appear to have had enough. Is a good mayor necessarily a good president? And is winning Eurovision its own punishment? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Tessa Shishkovitz and Phil Tinline will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll have a report from the Sauna Summit, which is a thing to which we did send someone. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Tessa Shishkovitz, UK correspondent for the Austrian weekly magazine Falter and author of Echte Engländer, Britain and Brexit, and by Phil Tinline, journalist, documentary maker and author most recently of Ghosts of Iron Mountain. Hello to you both.
Hello, good evening.
Hi, how are you?
I'm all right. Phil, it is your first time here on the Monocle Daily, so as regular listeners will be aware, you are observantly dressed up as Monochan, Monocle's owl mascot. You are resplendent in the owl costume. In order so your voice isn't muffled, we have now permitted you to unscrew the head. Introduce yourself to the listeners, if you would.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here and particularly pleased to have the honour of wearing the owl costume. I'll put the head back on every time I'm not speaking, obviously. I'm a journalist. I'm a writer. I once worked at the BBC. And yes, as you said, I wrote a book called Ghosts of Iron Mountain, which is about an American hoax which gets wildly out of hand, which sadly is proving still 58 years after it was concocted, all too topical.
It is an extraordinary book. I know this because I've read it and we have talked about it for an interview as yet unbroadcast. But yeah, it is one of those books I think it's fair to say would be hilarious if it wasn't so completely depressing.
So I was talking to a friend the other day I looked at where his bookmark was and it was at chapter 4 and I said, so that you're getting to the end of the funny bit, you're going into the dark because, yeah, it's about a hoax concocted by a lefty satirist in the sort of larky New York of the 1960s, and it pretends to be a report about what would happen if permanent global peace broke out, and there's a big kind of comic hullabaloo about it, but then much later it's seized on by the far right who take it far too seriously with unpleasant consequences.
Tessa, you have recently been journeying, etc. Where have you been and what have you been up to?
Well, first of all, now I thought when you said a hoax that in America that went out of hand, I thought it was about the election of Donald Trump, but no, it was not. I have had actually a difficult task in the last days because I wrote a cover story about the case of Gaza, which war crimes are being committed there, who is committing them, who is trying to report on them or not. So that's why I spend my days in front of the computer, because they don't let any independent reporters into Gaza, and who will possibly judge these war crimes that are being committed right now. So it's a dark story, it's a difficult story, it's a sad story, and I hope that the mood a little bit is changing in the international community now to think about what we can actually do to help the civilian population now.
Well, you have queued up our top item quite nicely there, because we will start with what appears to be a dramatic waning of the patience of some of Israel's allies. The UK has suspended trade talks with Israel and summoned its ambassador, and along with France and Canada signed a communique describing the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza as intolerable and Israel's behaviour in causing that suffering as egregious. It further insisted that Israel cease its recently renewed offensive in Gaza and lift restrictions on humanitarian aid on pain of what was described, with a notable absence of specifics, as further concrete actions. The statement also called on Hamas to release their remaining hostages and spoke somewhat wistfully at this point of the desirability of a Palestinian state. Phil, first of all, what has changed? These are countries which since October 2023 have been reasonably indulgent of Israel's behaviour in Gaza, even as it has become apparent that that behaviour is excessive and appears to have no end in sight.
Well, I think it's partly that there's been this period of basically not letting food aid in, which has been going on for, I think, 10, 11 weeks. But, I mean, Jeremy Bowen, the BBC correspondent, was also talking about how there was a particular incident on the 23rd of March where a convoy, basically, of medical workers was attacked, and then this was sort of covered over and effectively a sort of, a mass grave. And they found a camera that one of the people killed had sort of filmed the attack, and that gave the lie, Bowen was saying, to Israel's story. I mean, he was identifying that as a particular pivot point. Whether it's quite as simple as that in the halls of government, I would be slightly sceptical. But there's clearly, as you said, a very stern change of tone. I think it's also interesting that you see Canada, the UK and France. I mean, there's shades of the sort of post-Vance at Munich, post-American core, an alliance emerging, possibly, however ad hoc, which is doing this despite or round America, which is not, of course, how things would have worked before. So that's a change as well, I think.
Tessa, these are now, as of the recent or most recent elections in the United Kingdom and Canada, and indeed in France, you could say, governments of a broadly centre-leftish tendency whose own voters are less patient with Israel than perhaps the voters of their opponents. Might that be what this is about as well, that they are trying to calm down their domestic political difficulties?
Well, I'm not sure, Andrew. I think it has reached a point where, health organizations, Doctors Without Borders, everyone is reporting from a situation where there is a famine threat that is so imminent that I think it's really hard for democratic elected governments to just not do anything about it, even if you're an ally of Israel. And I think David Lammy today in the comments, the foreign minister, made quite a strong case to say also that it's not about not supporting Israel in its right of self-defense or being an ally and trying to make sense with both sides is a very important thing, I think, for the UK government, which is, the Labour Party is really trying not to have any whiff of anti-Semitism around it since the Corbyn years now have passed. And of course, it's the UK and France and Canada who can make a declaration like this. The Germans, the Austrians are not making this type of declaration because for historical reasons they're very careful when it comes to Israel and to question the sort of unconditional support and solidarity with Israel. But since the situation is really a humanitarian disaster, foremost, there is really a call for action, I think, for the governments. And I think that's the main issue that now the last days we had so many reports, including my own. There's a reason when media picks these things up finally and goes and looks for what is actually happening there. And it's unnecessary that these people are now losing weight because there was enough supply of food before these 2 months of blockade started. So it's really a possibility to change that. And that's why the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu started letting some trucks in, about 100 today, which is by far not enough, of course. But they need to continue this. And I think he's doing this because the pressure is mounting internationally.
Well, Phil, as well, possibly as a result of that pressure, Netanyahu, he has said similar things before, but he has once again outlined his conditions, which are Hamas release the hostages it still holds, Hamas disarms, Hamas's leaders, those who are still with us, go into exile, and the Gaza Strip is demilitarized. And he has made the case that any other country in Israel's position would be insisting on more or less the same thing. Is he entirely wrong about that?
I mean, I think it's deeply, deeply complicated. I mean, I think the thing that we obviously have to hang on to, no matter that the numbers are very different, is that the launch of this in October 2023 with an absolutely abhorrent, horrific attack on innocent Israeli civilians does sometimes get lost in the perfectly rightly, attention on the horrendous depth of the humanitarian situation. I think it's very hard. I mean, I'm not sure I'm in the right position to cast judgment precisely on what Netanyahu is doing, but I do think it's very striking in Lammy's rhetoric that you refer to that, again, it's not just Labour, I think, being careful not to sound sound anything like it sometimes did under Corbyn, but also just to draw on its own experience, talking about, we learned in Northern Ireland to defeat terrorists and their warped ideology, you cannot just rely on military might, talking about this being a recruitment engine for Hamas and so on. I think focusing the attention there on the fact that hostages have been got out more successfully through negotiation than through military might is important. And also, some of the language that Lamy again points to from the Netanyahu government about cleansing, which is, really kind of very dangerous indeed. That does seem to be something which is coming more into, the way that the British government's speaking.
Just finally on this, Tessa, and as you were saying at the top of the show, you have been speaking recently to people in Gaza. The statement issued by the UK, France and Canada did make reference to the idea of a two-state solution, which seems like a fairly optimistic ambition at this point. But I don't know if this came up in your conversations, but to the extent that people you were speaking to did talk about the future, did they talk about that as something that they still think is possible or imaginable?
Well, I think for most of the Palestinians that you speak to at the moment, they are saying, stop this atrocities against us. We cannot, how can they think about a political solution at the moment when they are sort of running from one corner of the Gaza Strip to the other? But it's also about the West Bank. So the question of the two-state solution, which everyone today in these statements was referencing to in the international community, is because people want to say we have a political solution that we would like to push for. The issue, of course, is that in the West Bank, since October 7th, the atrocities and the private revenge that settlers are taking towards Palestinian villagers, even if they just go and harvest their olives, has been gravely increased. And so there are about 950 people who have been killed in this type of violence, which means that you have unarmed civilians, again in the West Bank, which are being killed by settlers who are armed and where the Israeli army is watching. So because of these type of things, the belief of Palestinians that there might be a West Bank state of Palestine in development is really far-fetched for them. On the other hand, of course, if you would ask them, do you agree to a two-state solution? They would say, yes, of course. I mean, everything is better than being bombed.
Well, sticking with the motif of irritated Western nations threatening a recalcitrant interlocutor with the application of sticks rather than carrots, the EU and the UK have imposed still further sanctions on Russia, which might not prompt a Russian retreat in Ukraine, but may prompt an amount of bemusement that there is anything left as yet unsanctioned. For what it may turn out to be worth, the new list includes the so-called shadow fleet, i.e. the off-the-books tankers used to ship Russian oil despite embargoes. The announcement coincides more or less with US President Donald Trump's phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin, which reportedly went on for 2 hours. It is unclear how much of that was taken up by Trump wittering about water pressure or complaining that The Apprentice never won an Emmy. Phil, is this going to make any difference to anything at this point? We have now had slightly more than 3 years of people unleashing wave after wave of sanctions against Russia, and yet there in Ukraine, Russia remains.
Indeed so. I mean, I think we have to be very careful of a sort of elegant fatalism about this, because we're not in a position where this can be done through the United Nations, because Russia is on the Security Council, obviously. That's the ideal way of doing sanctions. It has been done in a more unilateral and piecemeal way, but I think that's not nothing. The impact, as it seems, at least in terms of correlation on Russian, GDP, does seem to be pretty sort of stark, and the British government's pointing out that, both the interest rate and inflation, as it happens, around about 20% in Russia. An awful lot of the economy is geared towards this sort of meat grinder. So I do think that, the application of sanctions, however messy and however imperfect, is worth pursuing. It's just absolutely manifestly not going to solve the problem on its own. I mean, I do wonder whether a little bit more attention, and the government has gone further on this in the most recent announcements, but a little bit more attention on those in Britain who are facilitating this quietly, who are making it just slightly easier for suppliers to find their way by hook or by crook to Russia, might be mind focusing. I mean, it's generally done in terms of sort of fines and so on. But I do wonder whether, if you're a British citizen who is aiding and abetting this regime and the war that we are working so hard to try to push back at, whether, the occasional prison sentence might help.
Well, on the subject of slightly more brisk and direct action, Tessa, is there not more obvious direct action that might be taken against something like a shadow fleet of tankers, which are not easy things to hide? To be clear, I'm not quite advocating just crying torpedoes away and sending them to the bottom of the Baltic, but they can be impounded. This has happened a couple of times in recent weeks. Both Estonia and Germany have seized ships from the shadow fleet, although possibly by way of demonstrating the difficulty, Russia then bailed up a Greek tanker as it left Estonia earlier this week.
Yeah, but I think there's such an ecosystem around this shadow fleet, which goes quite far, and you can't just arrest every ship that you meet, which is sort of... So this is just sort of... I think the EU especially is trying to have peaceful means and make up for the fact that, you can't just stop the war, and you don't have the soft power that President Trump would have if he would finally use it. But it's for the EU quite difficult to do these things. And of course, also as European states that, okay, so we have an oil price cap and we have this and that, and we've introduced all sorts of things. And it sort of lowered the Russian revenues 13% compared to 2022, March 2022. So it's sort of a real difference that it makes for the income in the Russian Federation. But of course they have India and China and all sorts of other big sort of places in the world to trade with. So it's small, but it's about a little bit more about of values and making a point and trying to sort of not give in also, because there's a lot of giving in. Of course, if you look what happens in Dubai and in all these places where Russians can still meet. If you think how our situation was in London or in European capitals or ski resorts before the war, there was a lot of sort of Russian money floating privately around here. And that, for example, has stopped, and that has, of course, a certain impact. It doesn't stop the war, but it has an impact on the sort of upper middle class in Russia, that they are not being able to spend this money as they did before. So all these things are just little stones in this mosaic, but I think they are still, as you say, Phil, they're quite useful to have.
Well, Phil, if they are useful, though, couldn't yet more direct and perhaps draconian action be taken? I mean, what is stopping the European Union from just going full pariah state on Russia, just saying we will not recognise Russian passports, whoever holds them, you just cannot come to Europe. We do not want your embassies in our countries anymore, pack them all up and take them home?
Well, I mean, that depends on which EU country we're talking about, because obviously the EU is not exactly united on Russia. I mean, the situation in the view from Budapest is not the same as the view from Bucharest.
But it would not be nothing if, for example, the countries which are properly crossed with Russia, took that action.
Oh, absolutely. And, I think you can certainly make the case for that. I think, I think you have to be careful in both directions, neither a sort of elegant fatalism nor thinking we can't, go further. And I do think, personally, I would support that. I think having any extra lever applied is a good idea. But I mean, I think, the fact you've got Germany so dependent on, Russian energy supplies historically as well is difficult. So, I mean, I suppose the question would be what the opportunity cost would be in terms of EU unity as well. But I mean, you perhaps better place to deal with that.
I think Germany actually has pretty much diverted from Russian gas, and did under the last government quite a big,
That's true.
Made a big deal out of it. Cost them also a lot of money because they have to buy higher priced gas,
right?
Liquid. So, but I think if you put Russian passports in general, if you block people from traveling at all, I think that's a pretty harsh and maybe counterproductive measure, because there are a lot of great Russians who need our help also, who are in opposition, if not yet in prison. So I'm not a big fan of blocking a whole population from moving around, because you might actually need these people and need to help them also to push this regime out of power. It's definitely not an easy thing, but I'm not a big boycott on people who are innocent person. I'm more for boycotting people who are actually involved in driving this war. And that's what the International Criminal Court will do now in this special tribunal that they just signed on the 9th of May in Lviv, in the Ukraine, which is a special tribunal for the war of aggression, which is that crime if you start a war and invade another country. So that's not the usual court that you get, and everyone agreed on that in the European Union and a few other countries around the world. And that's an important point, because on this list of these criminals who are responsible for this war of aggression are the higher echelons of the military and the political scene in Russia. These people we need to get and bring to justice, not necessarily the civilians who have, no way of doing it.
And you can see how the propaganda coup of arguing that Russians are being persecuted on a sort of ethnic basis would be an easy argument for Moscow to make as well. So no, I think that's true. But I agree with you to the extent that a greater degree of draconianism is potentially useful. But yeah, I think you're right, Tessa.
Well, to Eastern Europe then, and the possible benefits of elevating mayors to a country's presidency. This past weekend, in a second-round runoff, Romania did exactly that, preferring Nicușor Dan, Liberal mayor of Bucharest, to George Simeon, far-right nationalist. Poland may be 12 days from doing something similar, i.e. preferring, in a second-round runoff, Rafał Trzaskowski, Liberal mayor of Warsaw, to Karol Nawrocki, Conservative historian. The path from City Hall to presidential abode is pretty well trodden, though the record is mixed, embracing, as it does, Grover Cleveland, although disappointingly he was not the mayor of Cleveland, Jacques Chirac, Gustavo Petro, Rodrigo Duterte and Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Tessa, first of all, how relieved will quite a lot of Europe be if it turns out that both of these relatively liberal mayors of capital cities get over the line and become president?
I do like mayors of liberal capital cities, I have to say, after this Sunday. I mean, it was such a turnaround when Nicușor Dan sort of won these elections, because it looked really not good for him just a few weeks ago. And to stop his opponent is really very, very important for the European Union, as you are trying to insinuate here. Because, of course, after Viktor Orban and Robert Fico in Slovakia and in Hungary, we didn't necessarily need a third pro-Putinist PM in the European Union. As you know, it's relatively easy to block decisions by the European Union because everyone has a vote in these decisions. So it's enough to battle around or to try to find a way with Orban and sometimes with Fico. But to have a Romanian prime minister very much under the influence of Putin's agents is definitely not a good idea. So this is a big success. The problem with Poland, of course, is although we are very happy that Rafał Trzaskowski managed to come in first, he came in with 2% difference to Nawrocki. And so now the question is what happens in the second vote on the 1st of June. And it will be quite difficult to convince for Nawrocki to go to the voters of Menzen, who is a really very far-right politician who got 15%, is of course easier for Nawrocki than for Trzaskowski. So we have to see how the liberal mind can pull this off. But I was actually speaking to some of my colleagues of Gazeta Wyborcza, and they were quite optimistic that because they just had a peace government till 2 years ago, people still remember how authoritarian rule in this 21st century in Europe actually feels. And they are quite optimistic that people don't want to have a repetition of this. And interestingly, also the votes on the far right, which would naturally be not for a liberal candidate, they were very, very upset with the peace government because, for example, measures during the COVID pandemic, they didn't like them at all. Being a pro-Ukrainian government, helping Ukraine to defend itself against Russia, they didn't like that. So some of them might actually stay at home this time round and hand the victory to the liberal candidate.
In both of these instances, Phil, do we think being Liberal mayors of the capital has been a useful springboard to them? It does kind of reinforce and it's not just a European thing, I think it's been pretty much the entire post-World War II condition that there is this unceasing conflict between the big cities, especially the capitals, which tend to be liberal and cosmopolitan, and then there tends to be the smaller towns and the villages which tend not to be, and therefore end up massively disliking everybody in the capital, and that explains the politics of most of the Western world at the moment.
Well, I think there's something about being that scale of figurehead, that visibility of, not just figurehead, but, powerful figure in your own right, which is, clearly a useful stepping stone from the capital to staying in the capital, but running the whole country. I mean, you can see with, Klitschko in Kyiv that he was actually thinking of running in 2014 for the presidency and then sort of changed his mind and ended up running for mayor of Kyiv. But you can see that that's like not sort of two totally sort of disparate positions to go for. No, I mean, I think you can see. I mean, one thing that would be interesting is if you start to see, we've only really had mayors, directly elected mayors here in Britain for a relatively short period of time. If you start seeing that becoming an alternative route as our politics.
Well, we've had one mayor of London become Prime Minister, of course.
Well, we have, yes. I suppose I was trying to forget that. But I think he'd always been a national figure who kind of had a little kind of sojourn into City Hall. I'm talking more about people who kind of find their way up through that route. I think that would be, in the longer term. I mean, actually, if you think about people who've become mayors of London and Manchester and in Yorkshire and so on, Dan Jarvis, Tracy Brabin, and Andy Burnham, they have tended, like Boris Johnson, to be mayors. To be MPs first and have gone national and then out to the mayoralties. But I do think if that starts to become a way that people who are of a slightly different approach to politics to Boris Johnson get towards power, then that will be rather a good thing.
Well, we will move on to the mixed blessing of winning the Eurovision Song Contest. Legend insists that Ireland, towards the end of its astonishing run of early 90s Eurovision victories, 4 in 5 years between 1992 and 1996, and the Norwegian act which broke the sequence in 1995 was a half-Irish duo, was actively trying to tank in order to spare national broadcaster RTE the considerable financial burden of hosting the bloody thing yet again, a plan thwarted by the insistence of everyone else of voting for whatever nonsense Ireland dished up. It now appears that 2025's winners, Austria, and Austria's national broadcaster ORF are beset by similar concerns. Tessa, I take this to mean that Austria actually wasn't trying to throw it on Saturday, which is what I might have assumed, given the quality of that entry, or indeed the lack thereof.
Excuse me?
It was dreadful.
You thought it was dreadful?
I thought it was. I mean, I thought
better than me.
I thought everything else was dreadful as well. But yes, I did.
You really?
Yeah.
It's because you're a real music expert, and it doesn't help. If you have very
really
strong convictions. Because I don't judge the Eurovision Song Contest since my early childhood on the quality of the music, but it has something really, this love fest, and it's a queer festival, and everyone sort of has their, it's really like the gay Olympics, and I think it's high time that people also get to enjoy this. And so, I was thinking today, maybe if Vienna or if Austrians cannot agree who should host it in Austria, we should ask Budapest if they want to take over in the old Hungarian Austrian Empire state of mind.
Well, that escalated quickly.
Well, because in Budapest, actually, the government of Viktor Orban has introduced a bill that banned the gay parade in March, and it's now supposed to happen in June. So please come and join, everyone. But if they would have to host the Eurovision Song Contest, that would actually really make a point of having a diverse, pluralistic and queer society descend on Hungary and have a good time.
Phil, there are precedents for countries balking a bit at the cost. France didn't host it in 1963 because they thought we've already hosted the previous two. France had an Ireland-esque run of victories in the 1960s. Monaco claimed they didn't have anywhere they could stage it in 1972. Luxembourg couldn't afford it in 1974. Ukraine couldn't host it for obvious reasons in 2023. So do we, I guess, feel sympathy for the smaller country, which is going to have to stump up the 30 million euros it allegedly costs to stage this thing? Or do we say, you should have thought of this before you entered?
Well, I think I've got quite a lot more sympathy for Ukraine having a problem with staging it, and actually also Monaco, given that you probably couldn't physically fit everybody who wanted
They managed to hold a Grand Actual Prix in Monaco. I've got my suspicions.
Yes, I mean, I think there is something kind of deeply funny about it. I mean, I was thinking before I came, I know nothing about Eurovision and didn't watch it because I was sitting at my desk being a total dullard on Saturday night, as I normally do. So I think, I was just thinking that you could actually turn it into a movie, but of course Ireland has already effectively gone down that track that, you kind of design a band so bad that it is absolutely impervious to voting and it would cause a total scandal if anybody voted for it at all, but they still win, sort of arrangement. So no, I mean, it just plays, as you were saying, to the fact it's not about music at all. It's absolute high camp, and that's kind of the joy of it. And
but it's also, I mean, you're being a little bit too negative here also on the cost. I mean, of course, it costs a lot, yeah. And in Basel, I think they even had a referendum asking the people.
Switzerland, they have a referendum about everything.
I know.
Yes. But if you're in Basel, the people who ask are the banks, surely, though.
Yeah, exactly. But if you think of it, so it will be quite costly at a time where public broadcasters, of course, also don't have the money and have to fire people. And so that's really sad, all this. But there's such a profitability around tourism that a thing like this brings. So for Vienna, Vienna in any case is a little bit overfilled with tourists.
You don't have to hold it in Vienna.
And that's the thing. So I'm rooting for the cities that nobody ever goes to.
Because
don't go to Salzburg, don't go to Vienna, don't go to Innsbruck.
Salzburg have said that they don't want to do it or can't do it, haven't they?
They definitely have other festivals. Right. But, nobody ever goes to St. Pölten. That's sort of the capital, that name you don't even know. Andrew, I can see it in your eyes, because it's the capital of Lower Austria. It's not particularly chic, and it has a great conference center. So if they wanted to bring the song contest there, that would be a perfect place.
This is genuinely what I was thinking, because I did watch it on Saturday night, and I've never been to Basel, and I did think more than once, God, Basel looks really nice.
See?
And I cannot have been alone in that.
Sankt Pölten is what I recommend.
So just finally on this, Tessa, speaking on behalf of the people of Austria, is this regarded as an unalloyed triumph? Is everybody actually just genuinely very happy about this? Has there been waltzing in the streets of Vienna?
I think good news is always good news, and winning anything is for Austria really something, because as you know, we are even losing one world war after the other if we can. And then football always ends very low in the competitions and so on and so forth. So yes, I think people were quite pleased also because JJ, the 24-year-old young man who won, is quite sort of a nice guy, and he was singing about love. And, what's wrong with love? Andrew?
Tessa Szyszkowicz and Phil Tinline, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, the Sauna Summit is taking place today. It's an event hosted in London by the British Sauna Society, established in 2014 by a group of Brits and Finnish expats. The not-for-profit event has surged in popularity in recent years, attracting keynote speakers and delegates from all over, it says here, the world of sauna. This year's event centred on the exponential growth of authentic sauna experiences across the globe. Opening proceedings this morning was, of course, Finland's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Jukka Sukasaari. Regular listeners to the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio will have heard him interviewed by this broadcaster in a sauna. Before taking stage, the ambassador joined Monocle Radio's Tom Webb to talk about the importance of the summit.
Well, the sauna for us is a key element in the Finnish country branding. It is something that people around the world know about Finland, and it is also one of the secrets of the Finnish happiness.
And you say secrets of happiness, it's also sacred. You described how important it is to Finnish culture.
Absolutely. So the sauna is a very old institution. It is in many ways more than just a cleansing institution or a room for social interaction. It is a sacred place in a way, not in a religious way, I would say, but for the mind and the body to relax, to find harmony also with nature.
I don't want to be controversial here, but it was the Estonian ambassador last year. Why was that?
Well, the Estonians do have a sauna tradition as well, and they are related to us linguistically and, of course, as neighbors. So we do share the sauna culture, and the Estonians use it in their own way, and we respect very much their traditions as well. But the only genuine Finnish sauna is from Finland.
What makes a Finnish sauna? I understand there are no rules, as you were saying.
There are absolutely no rules. The only rule is that you have to be comfortable with your self. You have to be feeling good in mind and body when you're in the sauna, and that's why we are very much against set timelines or rules in that sense that you must stay 6 minutes or 5 minutes. You must have the temperature in certain range. It is all about you, and then you decide what makes you happy in a sauna, and that is the importance.
What about if it's all about you to the detriment of others? If you might become quite irritating with the way you breathe and the way that you move?
No, I absolutely agree. And what I was talking about, when it's only about you, it is when you're alone in the sauna. If you do it socially, with your family, with your friends, with your guests, obviously you must take their feelings and opinions into account. Sauna is also a place for conversations. We have done, and we still do, business negotiations in a sauna. Peace treaties have been formulated in a sauna, so it can be used as a location for unwinding and also lessening the tensions, perhaps, if there are social tensions between people.
Have you used your own sauna for that purpose? I know you have one in your residence here in London.
Actually, not here. We don't have disagreements with the British government that would require a softening environment, so to speak. But I do use it for inviting guests and getting to know them better. Of course, you have to know a person rather well before you invite him or her to the sauna, because it is a rather intimate experience.
Now, Sweden used sauna for their Eurovision Song Contest entry. What was your response to that?
Well, I would like to say that Sweden sought the best resources for their song from Finland, because the Swedish band Barabastu, Kai, who performed it, is actually from the Swedish-speaking region in the west coast in Finland. So we were happy to share the sauna, which they called Bastu, all wrong, with the Swedes, and we have a friendly competition with them as well.
And finally, you live and work here in London, but what would you like to say about the Finnish sauna experience? What would you like to say to people who haven't been to your country and experienced it?
Please do travel to Finland. You will find a sauna in every home, of course, but you will also find many public saunas, and they are more or less genuine, all of them. The important point was made today that in the Finnish sauna, there's always water. It's never dry, so you're supposed to throw water on the stones, which then brings the steam and helps the breathing and makes the experience more enjoyable. And finally, there should always be a body of water next to the sauna, be it a pool, a bathtub, or something that you can immerse yourself in chilling water after the hot bath, and that doubles the pleasure of the experience.
And it's called a lolja, is that right?
Löyly. The Finnish language is rather peculiar, but in the relaxation of the sauna, even the language studies are easier.
That was the ambassador of Finland to the United Kingdom, Jukka Sukasari, in conversation with Monocle's Tom Webb. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Tessa Shishkovitz and Phil Tinline. Today's show was produced by Laura Kramer and researched by Francesca Jokes. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.